Is this thing on? Hello, everyone. Miss Gomez is not here. She's over there napping, I believe. But I decided I would start this video off because this is really where things get quite dramatic. First of all, quick review. The colonies were very used to, well, largely operating on their own. The British, for the most part, had completely left them alone. And because they were used to this measure of independence, after the French and Indian War, the British, under King George, decide to govern them in a more uniform way. So they're used to having all of this freedom, and then the British decide to start cracking down, taking away that freedom. There's a vocab word which refers to being used to having freedom. Oh, how am I going to pick this up with my little feathers? Hold on. My throat is being squished, but it's called salutary neglect. Salutary neglect. Sorry, my face is being squished. Salutary neglect is a term we use to define that the colonists operated largely on their own, and they were quite used to this. Okay, now put this down, hold on. Sorry about that. Anyway, so, the colonists were used to being, like I said, quite on their own. And after the French and Indian War, especially with the Proclamation of 1763, don't forget what that is. Remember, that's when that crazy, his name was King George III, that's when he said, hey colonists, you can't go past this line. And they were really upset, because, like Miss Gomez mentioned to you in class, it's like if someone promised you a cake if you won a competition, and then they let you look at the cake, but you couldn't eat it. What's up with that? Unacceptable. Unacceptable. Anyway, so the man who was the king, as the colonists were getting angrier and angrier at Britain, their mother country, the king of Britain was known as, oh, here we go again, King George III. Okay, so King George III was the king during the French and Indian War, and he wanted to enforce this proclamation of sovereignty. I gotta put this down, hold on. Sorry about that. Anyway, King George III wanted to enforce this proclamation of 1763 and really crack down on the colonists, because he really did, for the proclamation at least, want to keep peace with the Native American allies. Now, things get worse. Remember that string we have over there? Well, it's going to be cut real soon, because the colonists get angrier and angrier and angrier and angrier and angrier. Sorry, British people are not really good at being angry. That was awkward for me. Anyway, like I was saying, the things get worse. So it wasn't just the Proclamation of 1763, it was also things like taxes, which we'll talk about in a second, but it gets even worse than that. Oh boy, alright, picking up another board. The Quartering Act. Now, hold on. Okay, the Quartering Act pretty much, Quartering Act said that the British had decided that because of all of the drama in the French and Indian War, that they would keep soldiers from Great Britain living with the colonists. Now the problem with that is, oh jeez, oh, can't do this. Okay, you get the picture. Hopefully you wrote it down. Hold on, I gotta pick myself up off the floor here. Anyway, the problem with the Quartering Act was that, well, the British soldiers were there, and where were they going to stay? Oh, no big deal, just in the colonists' houses. So, without even being given a choice, in order to save money, the British soldiers lived inside the colonists' houses, and the colonists were forced to provide them food and shelter and supplies, and this made them even angrier. They weren't paid any money for doing it. They had to take them. They had no choice. And their mother country, the British, forced this on them. Now, back to the debt that Britain still owed from the French and Indian War. So keeping troops in the colonies would, well, raise that debt even higher in order to try and keep the colonies under control. Britain needed more revenue. Hold on, let me go get the revenue board. I love you guys so much, I want you to know how to spell it. Oh, geez, here we go again. All right. Britain needed more revenue. And how would it get this revenue? Through taxes. Okay, so... in an attempt to have the colonies pay part of the war debt, it wanted them to contribute towards the costs of defending the colonies and governing them too. So anyway, in the past, what the king would do is talk to the colonies and get them to agree on taxes and then send that revenue to the British. But this time, he decided to skip that very important step and just pass the taxes, without even speaking to the colonies, because trying to get them to agree would take too long. So he just went ahead and used his power, King George, used his power to just immediately tax the colonies. And he starts to put very specific taxes on several of their goods and... Oh, hold on. Charles, what are you doing? I fell asleep for like 10 seconds. Did you start the video without me? Yes. Yes, I did. Charles, that was kind of rude. I can't believe you. Where were you? Oh. We were just talking about the particular taxes that King George put on the colonists. I can't believe you did that whole thing without me. Rude. Sorry, guys. Okay, anyway, so... You talking about the Sugar Act yet? No. Okay, so let's talk about the Sugar Act, alright? So, the Sugar Act, like Charles hopefully mentioned to you, did you talk to them about the taxes that King George had to put on them to pay for the war? Yes. And the Quartering Act? Yes. Okay, good. Anyway, so the taxes that King George put on them to pay for the cost of the war, to pay for the price of keeping the soldiers in the colonies, was taxing very specific things. Oh, thank God you're holding the board. How did he do this by himself? Wow. Anyway, so the Sugar Act, which was passed in 1764, placed a tax on sugar, molasses, and other products that were shipped to the colonies. It also called for strict enforcement of the act and harsh punishment of smugglers. So this means every time you ate sugar or, in this case, molasses, or any other sort of products like this that were shipped to the colonies, it had an extra tax on it. So, hey, you want sugar in your tea or in any of your food? It's going to cost you a lot of extra money. And so anyway, colonial leaders claimed that Parliament didn't have a right to tax the colonies because, as they exclaimed, can I say this part? Sure. Taxation without representation. Taxation without representation. Taxation without representation. Taxation without representation. As we've just shown you, it's very important for you to remember taxation without representation, meaning that the colonies were being taxed, but they didn't have a say in how. Okay? And that's very important. That leads to one of the main causes of the American Revolution. So anyway, it wasn't just the Sugar Act that had this whole taxation without representation. It was also the Stamp Act. And look, there's Paco and Joey. Anyway, the Stamp Act placed a tax, and all the revenue would go to Great Britain. Did you tell them what revenue was? Yes. Oh, good. Anyway, all the revenue, or a profit, would go to Great Britain in order to, again, help pay for the war. But the Stamp Act put a tax on all paper and official government documents, like stamps. But it wasn't just stamps. It was things like paper. It was things like newspaper. And what was even worse about the Stamp Act is you couldn't just pay in like goods. You had to pay an actual silver coin, which was really rare in the colonists. So there was tons of colonial leaders who were really upset by this. But one in particular was named Patrick Henry, and he's the one of the member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. Give me liberty or give me death. Yeah, that was one of his famous quotes. Anyway, so Patrick Henry called for resistance of the tax, and another one of the members who was in the Virginia House of Burgesses with him was like,
It's treason, which means like going against the British government, going against our leader, going against the king to do this. Treason is punishable by death. Patrick Henry's response is, if this be treason, let's make the most of it. So as you can see, Patrick Henry was kind of a troublemaker, but a cool dude. So the colonists protest the Stamp Act via boycott. So they say, fine, you know what? You're going to tax sugar, you're going to tax stamps? I'm not going to buy any British goods. Deal with it. Modern day boycotts include like the boycott of Chick-fil-A over gay rights. That's the first example that comes to my mind. But throughout American history and throughout the history of the world, there are tons of boycotts on different things, which just means you refuse to buy goods and services because you disagree with either the process or the people who are selling it. It varies. There were a lot of colonists who even began to form secret societies to oppose the British and their policies. The most famous of these secret societies was known as the Sons of Liberty. Anyway, so the Sons of Liberty were a lot of like lawyers, merchants, just pretty much a group of people who felt like the most affected, I guess, by the Stamp Act. Because remember, their goods are being stamped. People are boycotting their goods. The British are taxing their goods, and so it's making it harder for people to buy them, making it harder for them to make a living. Not all of their protests were even peaceful. A lot of times they would burn stamped paper whenever they found it. Here's one of my favorites. So what they would do is they would pour hot tar over the British representatives living in the colonists, and then pour feathers all over them, so that they kind of looked like me. Well, yeah, except they were, humans and had kind of a rough time with looking like that. But I'm so handsome. Well, yes, you are. Anyway, it was called tarring and feathering. And just picture, being poured with like hot wax and then thrown into like a vat of feathers so you look like a crazy human bird. And this is what they would do to some of the British representatives. I'll show you a picture of it next time in class. It's actually really ridiculous. Anyway, so finally, in 1766, Parliament's like, you know what, maybe the whole Stamp Act thing wasn't the best idea because we're making the colonists really mad, and we're nervous that, they might start to, actually protest and start a war. Spoiler alert, they do. So they finally repeal the Stamp Act, but in its place, they make something called, which is dumb of them, it's called the Declaratory Act, which says, P.S. We repealed the Stamp Act, but we still have supreme power over the colonies. Britain, the mother country, has supreme power. Well, this really takes off the colonists, and the tug of war back and forth between the British and the colonies begins. We'll continue to talk about this tug of war and how it ends up next time in class. Get ready to maybe cut that string.